In this next section, we'll be learning about animation with the end goal being to create a walk cycle for a character which we make together. I'll also be introducing how to make more detailed models using modifiers and further modeling techniques in order to make the character. So we'll be moving on from the low poly style onto more detailed, higher polygon models. Now, animation is a very big subject, so this is very much the basics to get you started. We should be putting together a full animation course in the near future, so do look out for that, but hopefully this will give you enough of an insight to be able to create fun and simple animations for your models and characters. Don't panic if it's going wrong and your animation ends up a bit messy. Try your best to have a go at the techniques shown, because even though it may not completely work for you, going through the process will be very rewarding, and the next time you try and animate, you'll find things much easier. Now you might be asking, what is a walk cycle? Well, particularly in games, you animate small actions which a character performs, such as walk cycles and running, and you loop those over and over with a certain button pressed. So as a player presses that button, they see that cycle over and over, which looks like it's walking. So let's get started making our character. In this lecture, I'll be reintroducing you to the animation workspace, and we'll be animating a basic cube with simple transformations. So I'm in a new startup file, and I'm going to go across to the animation workspace. So a quick reminder of what we covered last session. We've got the 3D viewport over here with our camera view, a basic 3D viewport here, just so we can move around our scene in general, the dope sheet and the timeline right at the bottom. And the dope sheet is a more complex version of the timeline. What I'm going to do is drag this up so you can see the timeline, and I'll bring the dope sheet up so you can easily see that as well. Then you'll be able to see the similarities and differences. So if I come around to the front a little bit more, I want to move my cube from one side to the other. So I move my playhead, and I can left click to move that. And the default is actually frame 1. It doesn't matter too much for this sort of animation, but if you want to be really accurate, then you should really start on frame 0. It makes more logical sense. You'll notice also we've got our start and end times here. So I need to start at frame 0 here as well. And let's select the cube and G then X to move it in the X-axis slightly off camera. If I look on the left-hand side with my camera view, just there. Now to insert a keyframe, I press I. That's whilst over the 3D viewport. So I'll click location and we see our keyframe added in our dope sheet and on our timeline. Now the timeline, we only see one keyframe. That's just to say that there is a keyframe, and it could be one, it could be many, on this object at that point. So it's a very simplistic way of looking at your animation. The dope sheet is more detailed, and if I open that up, you can see our transform locations there being keyframed. Now the summary, the point at the top here, is the same as the timeline. If I select that, I select all the keyframes underneath. I could have more than one object here that is animated, and I could select several of those animated objects at this point. And selecting this very top point here would select all the objects that I have selected, but I could go into individual objects like this cube by selecting this one here. This will make a little bit more sense when we have more objects in our scene. The next is cube action. Don't worry too much about actions at the moment, but an action could be seen as a kind of complete animation. Like a walk cycle and a run cycle would be two different actions, and you can have several actions in a scene. Then underneath that, I have the object transforms, and I can select that, and that will select all underneath. Then I can select individual channels, and you can see them being highlighted individually. So it's a basic hierarchy going upwards. When I select the top one, it selects all the ones underneath, apart from when we get to the bottom of the hierarchy here with the different channels. Again, don't worry if that's a bit confusing. The more we work on it, the more we do, the more it will make sense. So I want to move across the scene, past the camera, and I want to do that in 2 seconds. So a quick challenge to you, see if you can remember how to do that. Don't worry if you can't, just follow along with me in a moment. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so we want to move from here to here in 2 seconds. Therefore, I need to move my playhead along to where 2 seconds should be. Now, I've moved it to frame 50, and that would mean that there were 25 frames per second. Let's go across to our output properties, and we can see the frame rate is actually 24 frames per second, so it should be 48 to be precise. Don't worry if you put it at 50. I always like to put the frame rate at 25, especially if you're a beginner, because we can divide our timeline up so much easier with 25. So I'll move it across to 50, but do change your frame rate to 25 frames per second if you want it to be precisely 2 seconds. Not that that matters too much really. So after moving my playhead to that point, I can then, with my mouse over the 3D viewport, press G then X to move it across, past the camera again to somewhere like here. And now I could press I within the 3D viewport. You've also got a key option down here, and I can press Insert Keyframe there. If I select that, I have a few options here. Now currently we have just the location as our all channels, which you can see down the bottom in the dope sheet. So if I click that, it will keyframe the location of all the channels. But you could argue there's no real need to have the Y and the Z location as well, because it's only moving in the X axis. So you can actually just select one, go to the key menu and insert keyframes, or we can press I over the dope sheet for only selected channels here. So I could actually select my keyframes for the Y and Z location like this and press delete and delete those keyframes. And it will still work going across from one side to the other, and it's a little bit less confusing to be honest. So pause the video here and make sure you've caught up with me and you've got your keyframes going from 0 to 50 and your cube goes across the screen in the X-axis across the camera. Lastly, delete the keyframes for the Y and Z location. Okay, so it's a little bit dull at the moment. So what we're going to do is add in a floor. So Shift A to add and then plane, and I'll scale that up. And currently our box is inserted into our floor. So you can see that it slides along from one side to the other, halfway through the floor and not on top of it. So I'll select my cube again. And a challenge to you is now to change this animation so that it slides along the top of the floor. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but because we have no keyframes on the Z axis, I can simply G, Z, and then 1 and press enter. And now that's sitting exactly above my floor because this is a 2-unit cube and it was halfway in the middle. And now when I run my animation, you can see that it slides across the floor. Now that wouldn't have worked if I had keyframed my Z location, because I would have to change it for the end keyframe and the beginning keyframe. But because that channel is not keyframed, it doesn't matter. So hopefully that made sense to you and that's not too confusing. Now I want to give you a quick challenge of changing the animation length to 4 seconds so it takes longer for our box to go from one side to the other. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you remembered. We can select our end keyframe and you can select it at any point along here because it's only got one channel. And I can just press G to grab to move that along. So it's now at frame 100, which will be 4 seconds because our frame rate is 25. So now when I drag it across, it will take 4 seconds. And remember, the play button is the spacebar. You'll want to bring your animation to the start and you can then see that going across in real time. I'll press spacebar again to stop that animation. Okay, so I'll come round to the top slightly, and now what I want you to do, I want you to make this go across to this point here and down to this point here. So it's not moving upwards, just in the Y-axis that way and back again this way. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, now this was a little bit tougher because hopefully you realized we need to go back to the beginning and we need to set a keyframe for our Y location. Because if I go halfway through to frame 50, and press G then Y to move it up to here, and then I to insert the keyframe on the location, it will actually just animate at the top there because we had no starting point for our Y and no finishing point for our Y. So I'll undo that and I'll go back to the start and I'll press I to keyframe the location. That means we've got the Y and the Z in this location as well, because when I keyframe the location in the viewport, it keyframes all the location channels, X, Y, and Z. So I've got a starting keyframe, and now I need to go to the end and press I to keyframe that location as well. And now when I go to the middle, I can press G then Y, and once again, I to keyframe that location as well. And it's got all 3 keyframes there for all 3 channels. Let's play this animation, and you can see it going up the top there and background, which isn't so great because it goes slightly off the camera, but that's not important at this stage. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. Your last challenge then is I want you to rotate your cube around the Z axis 1 full revolution as it's doing its current movement across the screen. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you remembered you need to go back to the start. We can now press I and insert keyframe for rotation. And if I press the middle mouse button to move down, you can see the Euler rotation just there. Again, don't worry too much at the moment what Euler means. You'll get used to that a bit as you go along. Now we can go to the end of our animation, and in our viewport press RZ 360, and that's rotated around 360 degrees, and I can press I rotation. And now you can see the animation working just there. Okay, very last small challenge. I want you to zoom out a bit on your camera so you can see the entire thing. Change the end frame to 100 and render out your animation. Remember to change the resolution so it renders nice and fast. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you remembered the end frame is down here, but it's also in the frame range just here under our output properties. So I'll change it to 100, and you can see it change here and in my timeline, so I can move across here and zoom in slightly with my wheel. I'll go over the camera view, press N, under view, lock camera to view, N to clear that panel and just move out a little bit. Let's press play and see how that looks. Make sure we can see it all in frame, and that's fine. So I'll press the spacebar to stop that animation. Currently it's going to the temp file, so I need to change that to something more sensible. So I'm creating a folder called Practice Cube, and I'll double click on that to make sure I'm inside that folder and press accept. At the moment it's all still frames, or I can change it to FFmpeg to make it nice and easy. Just under the encoding, it's a good idea to change that to MP4 if you want it to be easily read. I can change this output quality to perceptually lossless and the encoding speed to slowest. If I scroll back up to the top, I can change the resolution to something like 25 so it renders nice and fast, and press Ctrl F12 to render out my animation, and you can see it rendering very quickly just there. If I want to run my animation again, I can come up to Render and View Animation, which is Ctrl F11, and that will play through my animation and loop it as well so I can keep watching it. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. Do make sure you've saved your work ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be taking our knowledge of animation further and looking particularly at the record function. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and we've got our animation frames in the middle here. Let's extend this by 50 frames and create a bit more animation. So I'll come to the end down here and type in 150. I'll zoom out a touch so we can see all those frames. Now hopefully you can see the difference between the timeline and the dope sheet. The dope sheet has all the animation frames for any object that is selected, so all the channels that you can see on the side here, whereas the timeline just tells us that there is a keyframe at these different points. So the timeline is a nice simple way of looking at animation, whereas the dope sheet is much more detailed. What the timeline does have, however, is this panel at the top here, which can be very useful, particularly the record buttons and the keyframe options here. So I'll bring down the timeline to about this point here, so we can just see that top panel, which, like I was saying, can be very useful. So at frame 100 is the current finish of our animation. There's nothing happening after that. So let's make something more interesting happen. What I'm going to do is show you the record button, or the auto keying button. If I click on that, everything I now do with my objects in the viewport will be recorded and automatically insert keyframes. So I'll go to frame 150 and press G to grab in the x-axis and move my cube back to the beginning. When I left click, watch what happens in my dope sheet. It suddenly inserts lots of keyframes. I'll bring that up so you can see them all just there. Now the slight problem with this is that it's added some scale keyframes as well, which I didn't really need. So the record button often records more than you need. You can limit what it records, but that's for another time. Most importantly, it was nice and easy to set our keyframes with the record button active. So pause the video here and have a go at adding another keyframe at the end for movement, but this time using the record button to record it. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'm going to show you a common mistake that I see lots of beginners make. I want to scale up my cube over the course of the animation. So I'm at the end of the animation. I can therefore press S to scale and make it much bigger like this. That action should be recorded on my keyframes here. That's great. So hopefully when I go through, it will scale up. But of course it doesn't, because I haven't got a scale keyframe at the beginning. So there's only one keyframe, so that's the size it will stay throughout the animation. That's a fairly important concept to understand, and it's one you'll certainly get used to as you go along. Now if I want to set a scale keyframe at the start here, so it gradually scales over the course of the animation, I can obviously just scale it down here and left click, and it will set my keyframe, and now it will scale over the course of the animation. I'll go back to the beginning of the animation, but I'll show you these buttons down here. I can press this button, jump to endpoint, and that will jump to the beginning of my animation. And by endpoint, it means these are two ends of the animation. So you can press this one to go to the endpoint at the very end, or this point to go to the endpoint at the beginning. If I press N on my toolbar and go to Item, I'll just bring this down so you can easily read that. You'll notice the transform controls are highlighted yellow. When I move across slightly, they go green. When they hit another keyframe, that's when they turn yellow. There's no keyframe on the rotation or the scale, hence why the location is the only one that's yellow. If I go across to the next keyframe, incidentally, I can press this button here, jump to keyframe. You can see that the rotation is also highlighted yellow here because we have rotation keyframes on this one. And if I go to the next keyframe, all of them are highlighted in yellow. So if it's highlighted green, it means it's got a keyframe somewhere, although not particularly on this frame. I'll jump to the next one. If it's highlighted yellow, it means there's a keyframe for that particular transformation. So I'll go back to the beginning with my jump to endpoint, and I'll set the scale in here to 1. So click and drag over all these parameters, type in 1 and press enter, and it has recorded that scale because we have the record option here. If I don't have the record button enabled, I can right click on these and say replace keyframe, but that's automatic because I have the record button enabled. So pause the video here and set the beginning keyframe for your scale size to 1. And as a quick challenge to you, set your end keyframe scale to 2. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you understood that you can go to the end keyframe by jumping here, and I can click and drag across these and change it to 2. So currently our animation goes around to the top and then back to the middle, scaling all the time. I want to challenge you to have the scaling only happen in the last 2 seconds. So it maintains its scale for 4 seconds, and then the last 2 seconds, it scales up. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so what I need to do is at frame 100, which is 4 seconds, I need to have a keyframe the same as this one here for the scale, which we know is 1. So I can click and drag across these and type in 1. And if you did it that way, that's absolutely fine. Or I can take the scale keyframes by box selecting them like this. So they're all selected there. And I can duplicate them with Shift D. So Shift D to duplicate, drag them across to this one here. And now I know it's the same here as it is at the beginning. So if I click and drag from the beginning, it keeps its scale of 1 and then suddenly scales up to twice as big. So as well as creating keyframes by recording, we can also press Shift D to duplicate keyframes. This is particularly useful if you have a set of channels such as the scale here and you want it to stay the same, so keep the same scale across this area. You can duplicate this keyframe to the endpoint that you want and it will stay the same in this area. Okay, lastly, I want to show you that you can animate other objects. So I'll zoom out just a touch, and I think it would be a nice idea if we animated our camera so it moves from here to here, but still points at our cube. So I'll need to animate the movement and the rotation. So your challenge then is to do just that, animate the camera from one side to the other, and you'll need to rotate it so it keeps pointing in the middle of our scene. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully remembered you need a keyframe at the beginning as well as the end. So make sure you go to the beginning and set the keyframe for where it is at the moment. Now I can keyframe the parameters in here, but obviously that will take a little while. Or I can press I over my 3D viewport and keyframe the lock rot or location and rotation. I could also come in here and click I within here and keyframe all channels. Or I can actually press G to grab, and without doing anything, just press enter and it will keyframe the movement because I've got the record button on. I'll open up the object transforms to show that it's actually keyframed the rotation and the scale as well. And we can also see that up here because they're highlighted in yellow. I can now go to the end frame, G to grab in the X axis. So move it across the other side. And I also need to rotate in the Z axis and bring it back to the middle here. Let's see what that looks like by dragging across my timeline. And I do manage to keep most of the cube in all the way through. What's often better is a slight curve to the animation like this, so coming out here in the middle so it doesn't end up zooming into an area, which it currently does. If I go to frame 75, you can see it's slightly zoomed in here, so I need it out here somewhere. So I can press G then Y at this point, so it zooms out slightly, and again, I've got the record button on, so it's recorded that movement. I wasn't quite on frame 75, I didn't notice, but that doesn't matter too much. And we can see we've got a slight curve to the animation now. So you can see there we can animate the camera as well. Okay, this time I'm going to ask you to animate the light. So we have a light in the middle of our scene here. I want you to move it from this corner here to this corner here. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so this is easier in top view. So I'll press 7 on my numpad, G to grab to move that into position. And again, we've got our object transforms recorded just there, cross to the end, G to grab, and move it to the last position. So hopefully you've gotten okay with that. One thing I'd like to show you is that you can also, if I go to the light properties, animate the power of the light and even the color. In fact, most parameters can be animated within Blender, which gives you a huge amount of possibilities. Let's do just that then. I'll go back to my beginning frame and I'll change the color to a red. Now this isn't activated by the record button, so you actually need to right click and insert keyframe. You can see a keyframe appear there, and the light properties have now appeared in our dope sheet. So for the moment, you'll need to right click and insert keyframe, or it's saying replace a keyframe at the moment. We'll change the power to 100 as well and press enter. And again, I've got to right click, insert keyframe. Then let's go to the end. I'll change the color to a purple, and that has set a keyframe this time. Because we told Blender that we want to start animating this, it's allowed it to be influenced by the record button. I'll change the power to 1000, and again, we've got a keyframe because it's highlighted in yellow. And we can see our light options down here. I'll just move my frame up a little bit more. You can see the RGB, which stands for red, blues, and greens, and the power there being influenced. I'll move across my top panel and go to rendered view. Make sure you're in Eevee for this, and hopefully your machine will be able to keep up. And I'll drag slowly across my timeline. We can see my light changing intensity and changing color from red to purple. So it's a bit dull at the moment. So what I want you to do is add a new light to the scene and also animate that, moving it across from the other corners of our scene. And again, animate the color and the power. You can have this one much brighter or darker. It's entirely up to you. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so you might have pressed Shift A to add and added in a new light from there. However, another option is to duplicate our current light. So Shift D to duplicate, and I'll move that up to the top corner here. You could have had it come from this corner over to there, or this corner over to there, or any other way, it doesn't matter. Now at the moment, it's sharing the animation properties of the other one, apart from the end frame, because when I duplicated it, I moved it, and therefore that was recorded. And I did this whilst my playhead was on the end frame. So I'll need to move those keyframes that it's got at the moment around into different positions. So I'll go back to the beginning and G to grab and move it down to the bottom corner here. And I'll change the color to something different like green, and the power, this time I'll go up to 2000. Let's see what we've got now. It's going across and they both change to purple and they both end up with 1000. So I'll change the color of this one to something like a yellow instead. And again, because the record button's on, it's inserting these keyframes for me, and we can see our animation of our camera, our lights, and our cube all happening in the scene in front of us. So hopefully you've gotten okay with that, and you're understanding animation a lot more now, and you're getting used to the idea of keyframes in animation. You might like to render out your results. Do remember to save your work before rendering in case of any crashes. And I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the graph editor to create a bouncing ball animation. So I've started a new Blender file, and a quick challenge to you is to add in a UV sphere and a plane for a floor. And I want you to animate the sphere so it falls from a small height over about 1 second and hits the floor and stays still. So you'll need 2 keyframes, one at the top and one at the bottom, and your animation should last for 1 second. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you got okay with that. I'll select the cube and delete it, Shift A to add UV sphere, and Shift A to add mesh and then plane. I'll scale the plane up so it becomes like a floor, and I'll move my sphere up in the Z axis so it's going to fall down and hit the floor. Now I can press the record button, and I'll just lift the timeline up a little bit so you can see the keyframes. I'll press G to grab and press enter just so it enters a keyframe because I have the record button active. I'll go across 25 frames, but do remember if I go to my output properties that the frame rate by default is 24, so I'll just change that to 25. You can keep it on 24 if you like and go to 24 frames, it doesn't make too much difference. But at 25 frames, I can now press G to grab in the Z axis and move it onto the floor. Now it's a little bit tricky from this view here, so I'll go to front view, zoom in a bit, G to grab in the Z axis, and get it a little bit more accurate to there. And you'll notice that I moved it twice, but because I was over the keyframe, the second time I moved it, where I was adjusting the position slightly, it overwrit the original one, so we've still got 2 keyframes here. So I'll change my end frame to 25 just for the moment, zoom out a touch and press play. And you can see my ball falling to the floor. So hopefully you came up with something similar to this. Let's go across to the animation workspace now. That gives us our camera view and the dope sheet as well. But what I want to show you this time is the graph editor. So I'll come across to my window options here and change it to the graph editor. And you can see this animation column here, which has the dope sheet and timeline at the top. Then there's the graph editor. And I'll bring this up slightly and let's zoom in on my object so I can see it a little bit more clearly. And I'll zoom out of my graph editor using the wheel of my mouse. So just pause the video and catch up with me, making sure you've changed your dope sheet to the graph editor and you've got a similar layout to mine in terms of space. Now the graph editor shares some similarities to the dope sheet in the sense that we've got our object here and we've got the object transforms here, or the channels. Now it gives them a particular color. We are actually only moving in the Z location. So I can select this one and shift select all the way down to the scale, right click and delete channels. That will make it a little bit easier to understand. So I've got 3 channels for location. Now I know it's not moving in the X and Y, but I'll leave those in there just to show you some elements of the graph editor. You'll see these have colors associated with them. So the Z here has a blue, and it's actually this one here. I know that because it's got some animation on it. It goes from this height here down to this height here. And it's focusing on the object origin of the object. That's why it's not all the way down to 0 here. The object origin is actually above the floor, hence the line is above the floor here. The X and Y are at 0 at the moment. So if I hide those, you can see those keyframes deleting. I can highlight a channel. So if I click on the X, you can see it in purple there. It's actually red, but it's over the top of the blue line of 0. So it's got a purpley color to it. So it's a mixture of the blue, which is the 0 line, and the red, therefore purple. If I highlight the Y location, you can see a mixture of blue and green, which gives us a slightly turquoisey color. And the Z is this one here, highlighted. I can actually change the height of this by holding down Control, pressing the wheel of my mouse and moving it upwards will change the height. If I hold down Control and use the wheel of my mouse and move across, it changes the width. So I'll make it a bit thinner here because we're going to add some frames to the end and bring this to the beginning. So now I've explained the X and Y. I'll select both those and delete them. So I'm just left with my Z location, which we can see here. So pause the video and catch up with me. Delete the channels we don't need because we're just using the Z location, and zoom in so you're seeing a similar size to what I can see here. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, let's start making our ball bounce. I've got 25 frames at the moment. I'll bring it a little bit further this way. Let's go to 100 frames. So it's going to fall and then it needs to come back up and down and up and down and up and down. So it hits the ground at frame 25 and it's going to bounce back up, not quite another 25 frames because we're going to have it decay in terms of its bounce. And I know 1 second is a long time for a ball to drop, but we'll sort that out in a moment. So I'll go an extra 20 frames and I can duplicate this keyframe here. So Shift D to duplicate and move it out to here. And remember, you can constrain it to the X axis by pressing X. So it's exactly the same height as the starting keyframe. So I'll left click there to set it, and I can press G to grab in the Y to move it down. Now that is slightly confusing because it's the Y axis in this 2D graph here, but obviously our object is moving in the Z axis. So up and down in 2D windows like this is always going to be the Y axis. Then it's going to fall again, so it's going to hit the floor, and I can duplicate this one, so Shift D, and then X, and I actually want to keep this in exactly the same position. A bit shorter again, and I'm at 65 now, which is fine because it's going to go up and down at the same speed. Then I'll select this one here, Shift D to duplicate, in the X axis, bring it along, and this time it's going to be shorter and not bounce as high. So if I go to 80, that's 15 frames, and then G then Y to bring that down so it doesn't bounce quite as high. And I'll bring that down a bit further so it starts to die off. And I'm around 2.5 up. It doesn't matter if you've got different heights to me. We can change this all in a moment. And then I'll duplicate this one, Shift D, in the X, move it across, and again, another 15 frames. And let's just see what that looks like. So I'll press play. So it falls down, bounces, and bounces again, and dies. And the bounces stop. It doesn't look much like a ball bouncing at the moment. But before I continue, pause the video here and catch up with me, making sure you've got a similar bouncing ball to what I have here. Okay, now hopefully you're getting the idea of the graph editor, that we've got the height axis coming up here for the Z, and obviously time going along the bottom here. But what I'm finding is when I drag across my timeline, as it comes to the first point, the falling slows down. And you can see that in the graph here. Its speed of falling increases, and this is constant here, but then its speed of falling here slows down. And we get an effect, if I bring the timeline back to here and press play, where it doesn't seem to be hitting the ground. So it slows down and almost hovers. One way of fixing that is changing the interpolation. If I click on this keyframe here, I can actually change the way this is interpolated and change these curves so they're a bit sharper and therefore we get a bounce. If I press T, the interpolation is the most important for us as beginners. There's constant, which I'll show you, looks like this. So that's an on-off. And in fact, I'll select all my keyframes with A and then press T and then press constant. So you can see this on-off idea. So it's on the floor, up, on the floor, up. Certainly doesn't look like bouncing. So I'll press T again. And incidentally, you can find this menu under key and then interpolation mode. Then we've got linear, which if I play that, takes away any curves. So that's good for the bottom of our bounce, but not for the top, as it looks like it's hitting a ceiling. Then lastly, if I press T again, we have the Bezier. Now the Bezier create these curves. And if I select this one here and scale in the X to bring it right in like this, we get a bounce. And it's correct at the top here as it slows down and comes back down again. So we need to make this one sharp like this one. I can press T and change it to linear, which is fine, but it's a little bit awkward and I have to move this Bezier handle here. And it has that because it's linked to another one that is a Bezier handle. It's actually just a bit easier to select it and scale it right in. And I'll do the same for this one, scale it right in. So I'll press play at the start and we've got a ball bouncing very slowly at the moment. Okay, so pause the video here and just take a quick look at the interpolation modes by pressing T, but we're going to leave it with Bezier for the moment. So select your bottom keyframes and give them a much sharper point by scaling them all down. Okay, now it's far too slow, this bounce. It looks like there's not much gravity. What I can do is select all my points and scale in the X to shorten this. But obviously I'm scaling into this sort of middle point of all our keyframes. So I'll undo that. And if I move my playhead to the front, incidentally, I do want to move this keyframe to frame 0. So I press G then X, move that across one, and the frame start to 0. I'm not sure why that's not default, to be honest. And I can select all my keyframes and I can use this button here, the pivot point, and change it to 2D cursor. Much like the transform pivot up here, it has a 3D cursor. If I now scale from here in the X-axis, it will scale according to where my playhead is. So I'll bring it to 50 frames and I want you to pause the video here and catch up with me, reducing the length of the animation to 50 frames. So let's see what that looks like by pressing play. That's not too bad. It seems to be falling at the right rate, but these top keyframes are a little bit sharp still, and it doesn't stay at the top of the bounce long enough. So if I select them all, change my pivot point to individual centers, and then press scale in the X, I can make this much wider, and now play it, and it looks like a bouncing ball. Although I do need a little bit more bounces along here. So pause the video here and catch up with me, selecting your top keyframes and using the individual centers pivot point to scale them up in the X so they spend a longer time at the top of the bounce. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so a challenge to you then is to continue the bouncing so it gets smaller and smaller until it stops, maybe at around 70, 75, something like that. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I can move our playhead across. I can duplicate these keyframes and bring them down here. I could move the ball in the viewport as well. It's entirely up to you. I like to be able to see the gradual decline of the height, so I'd rather duplicate a keyframe from here and move it across to here. And this one as well. So that's around this height. Probably needs to scale in a little bit like this, and Shift D to duplicate, bring it down to about there, and this one as well. Needs to become a little bit shorter actually, so probably around here, and G then X to move that across. And this is a bit tricky because there's no middle point, so I'll come to here and I'll bring this one back, so G then X. So it has the same amount of frames one side to the other. I can zoom in a bit to make sure we can see that nice and easily. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And again, I need to scale this in so there's a bit more of a curve. Last one, so Shift D, I'll move it down here, and this time it's going to be 2, scale it down a bit, and Shift D to duplicate in the X-axis across there. And you could do even a final one at a very short height here. I'll speed that footage up a little bit. And I'm just going to select all the bottom ones because really they're not quite sharp enough, so I can scale them all down, just make sure I've got the individual centers on, scale them all in the X, so they're very, very sharp like this. Zoom out a touch, and let's play our animation. And that looks great. I may as well stop it at frame 80. Now, if I was rendering with still frames, I'd actually stop it at frame 72 and just repeat the last frame. But if it's a video file, I want a little bit of stillness before I restart my animation. So it's bouncing like this, and then there's just a bit of stillness before it restarts the animation like this. Of course, you might like to render your animation. Just make sure you've moved your camera into the right position and that you've set up the output correctly and change the file format to FFmpeg if you want a video file. Also, remember to save your work before you start rendering. And I'll see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, I'll be going through the basics of bones, and we'll be setting up a snake for animation. So I'm in a new startup file, and I'm going to use my default cube as the basis for my snake. I'll come to front view with 1 on my numpad, and zoom out a touch, and scale the snake in the X-axis, so it's 4 meters long roughly, somewhere around there. So 1, 2, 3, 4 meters. And that's what our snake looks like at the moment. Now, if I go into edit mode, you can see the vertices of my object there. And if I try and add some bones to this to animate it now, it wouldn't work because we haven't got enough topology to deform. Let's say I try and take these ends and rotate them and move them. It can't bend because there's no extra vertices. So I'll undo that and I'll add some loop cuts going across the middle. So Control R, use the wheel of my mouse to somewhere around there, which looks roughly around 10, and left click twice to set them in place. So we've got lots of cuts across there. I can come to my dialog box here and show you that it's actually 10 if you want to follow along precisely with me. It won't make too much difference if you have 9 or 11, but you can type in 10 here to have the same as me. I'll minimize that and we'll come back into object mode. So pause the video here and catch up with me. Scale your cube in the X-axis and then do lots of loop cuts so we've got some points to animate. Now I want to show you a useful modifier here for adding and smoothing out topology. If we go across to our spanner or wrench here and add modifier, it's the subdivision surface modifier. So if I click on that, you can see instantly that it becomes a bit more smooth. And if I zoom in a bit, you can see that it's added some more topology. And in fact, it's divided every face into 4. If I go into edit mode, that will show what it looks like before the result. So there's our original mesh and the subdivision surface modifier is dividing it up and giving it more faces, which is great because the more faces we have, the better the distortion in our movement, which I'll show you in a moment when we add the bones. So pause the video here and add in a subdivision surface modifier to your object. So I'll come out of edit mode, back into object mode, and we need to add some bones to our snake in order to move those vertices. So I'll come to front view once again, and I'll press Shift A to add, and the bones are called an armature. So an armature is made up with 1 or more bones. So I'll click on that, and that adds a bone into the middle. But we can't see it very well. That's because it's behind our snake. So if I come to the object data properties here, where we've got this funny sort of stick man, and go to viewport display, if I scroll down a bit, there's an option in front. If I tick on that, you will always see the bone in front of the object wherever I move to. So that's very useful. I'll go back to front view and zoom out a touch. Now bones have 3 modes. If we come up to here, we've got object mode, edit mode, and pose mode. Edit mode is what we use for creating the skeleton, so the shape of the armature, and pose mode is what we use for animating it. So we always build our skeletons in edit mode. So I'll go to edit mode. I'll zoom into our bone once again, just to show you that you can now select the base, the middle, so the middle selects the whole bone, or the end. So if I select the base and press G to grab, it will move the base and make the bone longer. And the same for the end there. whereas the middle, I can move the whole bone like this. So I'll zoom out, and with the whole bone selected, I'll press G to grab and move it somewhere to the front here. It doesn't have to be to the very front. This bone will affect all this area here. I'll select the end and just extend it slightly, so it's covering about 3 Blender units there. In the same way as modeling, I can have the end selected and press E to extrude, and I can constrain to the X-axis and bring it out so it's the same length. Okay, so pause the video here and catch up with me inserting a bone, then going into edit mode and placing it at the front, and then extruding from the end to create a new bone. And I want you to create a few more bones until you get to the middle point here and make them roughly even. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll extrude in the X-axis once again to here and just keep doing that all the way along until I get to the middle. Now this end one is a bit longer than the others, so I can easily just come into these points and G to grab in the X and just even it out a little bit. Unfortunately, there's no command for distribute like there might be in something like Photoshop or something along those lines. So we would have to go by the grid lines. It's not important if they're slightly different sizes, it won't make too much difference to our animation. Okay, so just take a moment to even out your bones a little bit if you haven't already. Okay, so we've gone to the middle and I can actually select all my bones. And do remember, I am still in edit mode at this point, so you're always editing the shape of your armature in edit mode. And I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate in the X-axis and bring them across to the end here. Now we've actually got 2 sets of bones within our armature. So these bones over here are joined together. If I press G to grab on this joint here, you can see it moves both the bones. We can join those together, but before we do that, I want to show you pose mode and how them not being connected would cause us a problem. So I'll go across to pose mode. And when I select the bones, they turn blue now, indicating that they're in pose mode. And there is a parenting system going on. This one is parented to this one, which is parented to this one, all the way down to the end. So if I press R to rotate on this one, it rotates the end one as well. So it's a bit like a shoulder joint and then a forearm joint, for example. I can then rotate this one independently. So this would be an elbow, for example. And that is the reason we need these ones joined to these ones, because we would want to rotate this one and have them all rotate. So I'll undo those movements and go back to edit mode. In order to connect this bone to this bone, we select this bone first, so that's the one we want to connect, and then the one we want to connect to last. So that is the active object highlighted in yellow. And as usual, we press Ctrl P to parent. Now there's an option here to keep offset. That would actually connect them, but keep them a distance apart, whereas connected, if I press that, you'll see it actually moves and joins together. So now when I go into pose mode and rotate this one, you'll see it rotates all the other ones along the line. So I'll go back into edit mode and I want you to catch up with me, duplicating your beginning section of bones and move them to the end, and then join the middle 2 together with Ctrl P to parent. Remember, you're selecting connected. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now lastly, I'll show you that you can select a random bone and Shift D to duplicate. And can you see the black dotted line if I zoom in a bit closer there? That's to show that they are connected with an offset. So remember the Ctrl P command and there was keep offset. That would be an offset. If I go to pose mode now, and let's say rotate this one here, R to rotate, can you see how it's still affected this one here? Because they are connected with an offset. So that's the idea behind an offset. So I'll go back into edit mode, select this bone and press delete to delete the bones. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk about animating our snake. So make sure you saved your work here, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be animating our snake, and I'll talk a little bit about weights. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And before parenting our snake to the bones, it's a good idea to just check a couple of things. First of all, I'm in edit mode with my bones still. So I'll just go to object mode. And the first thing to check is that your bones are sitting nicely inside your object. So they're not, for example, off to the side here or something strange like that, which from front view would look like they're working. So I'll just undo that. The other thing that's worth doing, although it shouldn't make too much difference, but I always find it's a good idea to select both of your objects and press Ctrl A and apply the rotation and the scale. That way, when I click on these objects, press N to go to my toolbar and go to item, we've got 0 on the rotation and 1 on the scale. Now I've also got 0 on the location. That means they are right in the center of the grid. And if I click on my bones, they've got that as well. That's always a good idea to set up as well. To make sure it's right in the center, I can't just press Ctrl A and apply the location, because let's say this was off to the side like this and I press Ctrl A and apply the location. That's set it to 0, but it's not actually in the center. all it's done is moved the object origin to the center and my object is still over here. So I'll undo that. What we need to do is make sure that the object origin is in the center of the object and that object origin is in the middle of the world. So instead, if I've moved this out to this position here, I can actually press Alt G to remove any of the movement, and that will set the object origin back to the center of the world. If for any reason the object origin is not in the center of your object, remember you can press right click, set origin and origin to geometry. That will move it into the middle of the geometry, and then you can press Alt G to clear the location and move it to the center of the world. Now all this shouldn't actually make too much difference to our very simple snake here, but it can make a difference when we're coming to do more complex things like characters later on.
So don't worry if it's not completely making sense, we will revisit these things later on.
So just pause the video here and double check that both your objects, the bones and the snake, have no rotation and a scale of 1, and that the object origin is in the middle of the grid and in the middle of your object. Pause the video and make sure of that. Okay, now I need to parent my snake to the bones. So the bones we need as the active object, and they will be the parent, and the snake object will be the child. So I select the snake object first, and then the bones second, to make them the active object, and Control P to parent. Now you get a slightly more complicated menu this time. The easiest one is with automatic weights. So I'll click on that and I'll show you what that does. If I select my bones now and then go across to pose mode, it should be the case that I can go into my bones and press, let's say R, then Y, and rotate the bone, and you can see it deforming like this. I'll grab this one and press R to rotate around the Y axis, and again it deforms like so. To remove the pose I've created, I can select everything and press Alt R and press enter to remove any rotation. So I'm back to where I started. Now I'm going to go back to object mode and choose my snake now and go into weight painting. Now what this is showing me is the amount of influence a certain bone will have on my shape. So we are seeing the influence of this end bone here. I'll zoom in a touch on that, and you can see that the end section here is all red. That means this end section and the vertices are only affected by this one bone here. It slowly goes towards blue through the yellow and green colors, and that means these vertices here are partially affected by this one, but partially affected by another bone, which will end up being this one here. So if I go back into object mode, and incidentally I can press Control Tab and use the pie menu for that, it's a little bit faster. Choose my bones and Control Tab to go into pose mode. Because there's only 3 modes, I can either press Tab to go into edit mode, and Control Tab now will give me the pie menu because there's 2 options. But anyway, we're in pose mode, and if I rotate this bone, so R then Y,
You can see the area that was painted red is fully influenced by that bone, and the areas that were going towards blue in colour are over here being influenced slightly by this bone. But this area is also being influenced by this bone here.
It does create a bit of a dent here, and what's sometimes known as pinching, where this area is kind of pinched together. And that's a common problem when you are rigging characters, especially ones that are more low poly than others. So this shape is relatively low poly compared to some, and we could have less pinching by having more topology and also more bones, so there was a smoother transition rather than this harsh angle of these 2 bones. But for now, we're not too worried about that. We're just getting used to the idea of animating objects with bones. So I'll undo those steps and just zoom out so we can see our object. And I want you to pause the video here, catch it with me, and parent your snake to your bones. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so let's start animating our snake. I'll go across to the animation workspace and I'll just come around to the front here. For the moment, I don't need my camera view. I can set that up later. But because my snake's quite long, it will be useful to have this whole area here with the 3D viewport. So I'll come up to the top and drag across. Also, I'll bring my dope sheet up just a touch. And remember, we've got the timeline down the bottom here. I'll go to front view and zoom out just a little bit. So let's together create an animation where the snake moves upwards into an S type position. So this position is fine for a starting point. Now I'm in pose mode, and generally speaking, you'll set up most of your animations in pose mode. Now if I go to object mode with Control Tab, I can still press G to grab and animate the movement of the entire object in object mode. And that does have its place. Let's say you set up a walk cycle and a run cycle for a character. That would all be set up in pose mode, and it would run and walk on the spot. And you would animate the whole entire object to move around your scene in object mode. And that's generally the kind of system that games will use. But if we want to move and adjust the shape of our snake, then we will do all that within pose mode. So I'll go across to pose mode, and this is a good starting position for our snake. So I'll select all my bones. Do remember to select all your bones before clicking I to insert a keyframe. And we could just use the rotation, but I'll use the location and rotation just in case I did want to move it along in some way. And we can see in our dope sheet, I'll just bring that out a bit more. We've got all our bones here, and they've got a keyframe on them. You can also see if I open up the bone, each individual channel, so rotation here and location there for each individual bone. I'll minimize that though and bring the dope sheet back down. So pause the video here and catch up with me, selecting all your bones in pose mode and keyframing that first position. Now I will leave it on frame 1 for the moment, but strictly speaking for looping animations, you should start your keyframing at frame 0 so you don't miss any frames. But that won't affect us here. Anyway, let's say it takes a second for the snake to rear upwards into our S position. So I'll move my playhead to frame 25, and I'll press the record button this time and start rotating the snake into position. All our bones will be rotated. The only bone we can actually move is that beginning parent bone right at the front. Yours doesn't have to look exactly like mine, but something like this will be fine. And again, it's a little bit jaggedy in the way it looks. And for this to look better, we would need more topology on our object and more bones for a more curved shape. But for now, this is fine. In fact, I'll just go back a little bit further so it's rearing up quite far backwards like this. And there's a big kink there, but again, doesn't matter too much. Let's just check our animation's working. So it goes from the floor and up to this position ready to strike. Okay, so pause the video here and catch up with me, animating it from a lying position to a reared backward S position like this. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so as a challenge to you, I want you to make your snake strike outwards to maybe hit something out here, or maybe down at the bottom here, depends on how big the enemy is, and then go back to its reared up position. So it strikes out and then goes back again. One thing to think about here is we want it to be fairly quick. So think about how many frames you're going to use. And remember, you can easily adjust those if you need to by moving the keyframe. And the other thing to remember, you can duplicate this current keyframe at the end of it striking out. So create one keyframe for it striking out and then duplicate this one for it to come back to. Hopefully that makes sense. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I want it to be nice and quick, so we'll do it in, let's say, 10 frames. But it might still be too slow, but we can easily move it. And let's move it into a position where it's striking out. And I'll speed this footage up, but it's, again, me just rotating the bones. So possibly something like this, we can check and see how that looks. So from here it goes, pa-cha, or whatever noise, or probably more a hissy noise, to be fair. That's great, so we can move along a little bit further and duplicate this keyframe. However, it's really important to realize that I haven't got all my bones selected, so I'm only selecting one bone. So if I chose that and press Shift D, that would actually only keyframe that bone, and you can see just that bone wiggling around just at the end there. So I'll undo that. So I have to select all my bones and then select the keyframe at the top to select all the bones underneath and Shift D to duplicate and bring that to the end here. So it goes pa-cha and then brings it back again. Let's see what it looks like from the start. It rears up and then strikes out, but very slowly. So again, selecting the keyframe at the top, making sure all my bones are selected. G to grab, move that one in, and G to grab to move this one in. Maybe it's a little bit slower to come back to its reared position, but very fast with the strike. Let's try it now. A little bit quicker, so I'll move those in. There we go. I feel like it needs just a little bit more adjustment though. There we go, dangerous snake. Okay, last challenge to you then is to continue your animation so it pauses in this position slightly and then goes back to lying down on the floor. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, now hopefully you remembered that in order to pause in this position, we need to copy this keyframe here. Again, with all the bones selected, I can press Shift D to duplicate and bring that out. Now when it strikes out, it comes back to this position and stays there. And then we want it to go back to the resting position. So I can move my playhead along, take this keyframe, again, with all the bones selected, Shift D to duplicate and bring that across. Let's just bring our playhead to the beginning, see how fast that is. Strikes out, back there, and then lies down. Now it lies down a little bit fast, so I'll move this end keyframe across a little bit further. Again, make sure you have all the bones selected. Start at the beginning, strikes out, and then lies back down. Maybe even a little bit further. and we're on frame 70. So I'll go back to the beginning, have a look at my strike, and it lies back down. That's great. Now I can loop the animation. So if I finish it at, let's say, frame 80, so I can change it down here to 80 and press play. Strike out, go back to the beginning and start again. Notice that I went 10 frames beyond the end of my animation. If I change this to 70, watch what happens. It strikes out, goes back, but it straight away lifts up and does it again. So having a bit of a pause there gives our snake time to do another loop. So I'll change this back to 80 and press play, and we've got our animation looking wonderful. Okay, so hopefully you got an okay with that. You might want to now render out your scene, so remember the settings from the previous videos, and as always, remember to save your work before you start rendering. In this lecture, we're going to make a television using subdivision surface modeling, and this will work as the head for a character we're going to make so we can animate a walk cycle. So I'm in a new startup file, and to create our TV, I'll use the default cube, so I'll select that, and to give it some roundness, I'll add the subdivision surface modifier. So I'll come across to the modifier properties here, add modifier, and subdivision surface just there. So when I add it, it's one level of subdivisions. So if I move in a bit, and I'll go to edit mode so you can see the original shape. With one level, each face is divided into 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side. And with that subdivision, it smooths it out. Now I'll just quickly undo those steps and show you that because this is used so often as a modifier, there's a really handy shortcut. If I press Ctrl 1, you can see it adds the modifier there with one level of subdivision. If I press Ctrl 2, it's 2 levels, and Ctrl 3 is 3 levels. So it's dividing each face into 4 3 times. And you can see it ends up being quite close to a sphere because it's all been smoothed out. It's worth pointing out that the render level is usually set a little bit higher than the viewport levels, so that when you render, it's even smoother, and when you're in the viewport, you've got fast navigation. So what I'm going to do is put the render levels up to 3, so it's the same as my viewport, and if you've got a slow machine, then do put this down to 2 if you find that it's lagging at all. Most computers should be able to handle 3 levels without a problem, so we should be okay with 3. Okay, so pause the video here and add a subdivision surface modifier with 2 to 3 levels of subdivisions. Okay, so I'll go back into edit mode. Now you can follow along with me if you like, but I'm just going to show you some aspects of modeling with subdivision surfaces. First of all, if I press Ctrl R to do a loop cut around the middle and double left click, instantly you can see my shape change. If I come around to the front, you can see that it's a lot flatter along the top, and then it curves around a bit more evenly around here. And if I view from the side, it's still fairly circular. So what happens when I add in the loop cut? I'm obviously adding in more faces and therefore more subdivisions. And if I come around to the top, let's say, and press GG, so edge slide, and move that across, you can see that the curve becomes even sharper, and it's more rounded at the back where it loses that extra edge loop. So when we're adding geometry with loop cuts and extrusions, it will affect the curviness of the shape and the sharpness of the edges. If I press GG and bring it right to the edge like this, you can see that it becomes a lot sharper. If I press Ctrl R and do another loop cut around here, and then bring that right to the edge as well, and I'll go back into object mode, we get quite a sharp line across here as those loop cuts get closer together. So back into edit mode. Often these are called supporting loops because they support the structure of the edges. So this is something to bear in mind as you're modeling with a subdivision surface modifier on your object. So I'll undo those steps and go back to my original cube, and let's start modeling our TV. First of all, I'll add a mirror modifier. So I'll press N on my keyboard and go to Edit and use the Auto Mirror add-on. Remember that's in Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, type in Auto, and you should see the Auto Mirror just there. Make sure that's ticked and close that down. Now I want it to be in the X-axis, so along the X-axis here, and I want the positive orientation so that I'm going to be working on this side, which is the positive X. Just do make sure that you've got your object origin in the center when doing this, and then I'll press the Auto Mirror button. And you can see it's deleted half of my shape, added the mirror modifier, and it's got clipping on, so the middle is stuck together. What you'll also notice is that our shape has changed. So we have added a loop cut down the middle, and therefore that has slightly sharpened up the curve across here. One other thing that's worth noting is that I have my subdivision surface modifier first, and then the mirror second. And the order of these, commonly called the stack, is important and does make a difference. And actually, it's generally considered bad practice to have the mirror modifier not at the top of your stack. I'm going to leave it where it is for now because I want to highlight this point later, and we can easily move these around just by clicking and dragging them and putting them into position. But like I say, I'll leave that as it is for the moment. So pause the video and catch up with me, adding a mirror modifier along the x-axis using the Auto Mirror add-on. Okay, so let's try and make the shape of the television. First of all, I'll come around to the side here, and it's a bit round at the moment. So if I press Ctrl R to do a loop cut there, and left click once and drag it up to the top to maybe somewhere around here. I'll do the same around the bottom, somewhere around there, not quite as far because we're going to have a place for some dials at the bottom there. So it's looking a little bit more square, but if I go from the top, we can see that we need another loop cut across here to sharpen this area up here. So Ctrl R and then loop cut there and drag that to the front. And we've got a little bit more of a TV shape there. It's possibly a little bit rounded at the back, so we can press Ctrl R and maybe bring that back, not quite so far, maybe somewhere around here. We've got a very sort of square TV. I quite like this sort of rounded shape here, but I think we need it a little bit sharper with another loop cut somewhere around here. Okay, so pause the video here and add a bit of sharpness with these loop cuts in the same way I've done here. Don't panic if it's a little bit different from mine. We can adapt the shape as we're going along. Okay, so we've got our curvy cube here, and I think it needs to narrow a bit as it goes towards the back. So I'm going to go to X-ray mode so I can select the whole of the back like this, and let's scale that down a bit. Now do remember it doesn't scale in the X in the same way because it's the median point of the object selected, not the other side as well. So I can press scale in the X to scale that a bit further. I can even press G to grab in the X to bring it in like this as well. Now obviously it's bending a bit in the middle here, so I can select these edges here and G then X to bring those in like this. And we've got a bit of a curve going in, and I think I'll scale these in the Z as well to bring that down to somewhere around here. Perhaps a little bit more adjustment just there, and that's about right. It might be a little bit long, the TV, so I'll press G to grab in the Y this time and move it in a bit. I'll turn off X-ray mode so we can see the final result, and that looks a fairly good shape at the moment. So pause the video here if you need to catch up. Okay, now I'd like to have a little bit more roundness here. So I can either select this edge loop here and press GG to edge slide to create that, but I don't have to do it that way. I can actually just select the top edge like this. Oh, make sure I get the last one there as well, and press GG to edge slide just those. And you can see that rounds out a little bit more. I could then select these ones here and GG, and again, it rounds out a little bit further. So there is the option to do that, but I'll just undo that for the moment, because what we can also do is select the very edge just here, and again I'll come to front view and just model that curve in like this. And the same with this one here, G to grab and create a curve like this. I think they're a little bit wider at the bottom, ready for that sort of control panel down here, looks about right. Okay, so take a moment to add a little bit more curvature to the side edges there. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, let's work on the screen at the front. So I'll press 3 to go to face mode and select that face. And I can press E to extrude in the Y-axis to pull that in for a screen. Okay, so that's worked reasonably well, but it's very, very rounded. So look at the shape and have a quick think about how I could make this a little bit more square. Pause the video if you like. Okay, so if I press Ctrl R and do a loop cut around here, I can move it in to make it a little bit more square, or have it a little bit more curved like this. So somewhere around there looks good. And again, I can press Ctrl R and create a sharpness there, and Ctrl R and a bit of sharpness down here. So we've got this area for a TV screen. But I feel like it's a little bit too curved around here. So coming in to the screen itself. Have a quick think about how we can sharpen up these lines coming across here and down here and across here. Pause the video if you like. Well, if I press Ctrl R, I can do a loop cut around the middle here, and I can move it closer if I want it sharper, or just leave it in the middle by right clicking, which will cancel any movement. And that's sharpened it up nicely. We've got a really sort of rounded looking TV. So pause the video and sharpen up that screen area. Now lastly, I might want to sharpen up the bottom here, because it's very sort of curved around here. That's more a preference thing, but I can press Ctrl R if I want to, and double left click if I want to sharpen that up at all. Let's see what it looks like with and without. So that's without, with Ctrl Z and Ctrl Shift Z to redo. And actually, I think maybe I prefer the curves, so I'll leave it out. Okay, now before doing the television screen, you might want to make any adaptations to the shape. Maybe you want the screen to be a little bit bigger. Probably easiest in front view and then X-ray mode. Perhaps I'll come around to the side so I can see it a little bit more easily. And I can select these edge loops coming through here. A little bit tricky to see. Hopefully you can make that out. But I can select all those going around there. And I can G then X to move my screen out a bit wider. But do be aware it is making it slightly less round. So maybe out to here. And I might want to change that top loop coming from here across to here. And remember, you can hold down Control to take the shortest route. And GG to edge slide that across if I want a little bit more roundness to the top. I'll undo that though, because I think that's about right. And you might want a little bit more of a screen up the top as well. So go G then Z and move that up and you've got a little bit more of a screen. It's looking a little bit untidy at the back here, so do watch out for those sort of things. And I can select these lines here and edge slide them down, and just this vertex here and GG to edge slide that across. Let's go to object mode and see if that's worked. That seems to have done an okay job. Okay, so I think that's about the right shape for my TV. Again, you can have a different shape if you like. We'll work on the screen in the next lecture, but make sure you're fairly happy with the shape of your TV now, and make sure you've saved your work ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be finishing off our television and learning a bit about the modifier stack and practicing subdivision surface modeling. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And I'll just turn off X-ray mode now so we can see our television and how we're getting on. So let's work on the screen area. I'll select my television, and I may as well rename it now to TV, as we will start adding a few more objects now. And I'll go into edit mode, and the screen section will be these faces here. Now don't follow along with this just yet, but if I go to face mode with 3 and select those faces there, I can make them a bit sharper in here by pressing I to inset, and also B for boundary so that it excludes the mirror. And can you see how the inset, the closer it gets to the edge, the sharper that is. And I could make it nice and sharp like this. However, it's a little bit easier, if I undo that, to separate the screen from the TV. So if I press P to separate and by selection, we can see that we've got a separate screen. We have got this problem in the middle, and I'll talk about that in a second, but you can see that it's much sharper around the edges here. It will also be much easier for when we texture later on. So I'll go into object mode and select the screen, and let's label that screen as well. Now notice that the screen keeps the modifiers from the object it was separated from, so it's still got a subdivision surface modifier and a mirror. And as I was saying earlier, the mirror modifier is underneath the subdivision surface modifier. So the subdivision surface modifier is happening first. So let's hide the mirror for the moment, and that's what the subdivision surface modifier looks like. Then we add the mirror to that, and you can see it's just copying this half over to the other side. However, if I click and drag the mirror above the subdivision surface modifier, we can see that instantly disappears because we have, if I hide the subdivision surface modifier, that's tricky to see, so I'll go to local view with /. We have the mirror happening first, so we've got this half mirror to the other side, and then the subdivision surface modifier happening after the mirror. So the second modifier is taking into account the first modifier's effects. So back out of local view with /, and with my television selected, and a small challenge to you is first catch up with me by separating the faces for the screen, then selecting the screen. You'll have to come back into object mode for that, move the mirror modifier above the subdivision surface modifier, and I want you to do the same for the television. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you found that fairly straightforward. With the TV selected, I can click and drag the mirror above the subdivision surface modifier, and it gets rid of these funny anomalies. Now it'd be nice if the screen had a bit of a curve coming out here like an old retro screen, so I'll select our screen into edit mode and select this face in here, G to grab in the Y to bring that out so it's nice and curvy like this. That looks quite fun. I feel like it's inset a bit too much, so I might press G then Y and bring it forward slightly. I'll just double check that that's still inserted fine, and that looks good. Also at this stage, I think it's a good idea to select both our objects, right click and shade smooth, and that looks a lot nicer now. Now let's add some dials at the bottom. So I'll shift right click to this point here, shift A to add, mesh, and then cylinder. Currently it's got 32 vertices and we'll keep it at the default. Because we're going for a nice finish now with smooth edges, it helps to have a lot of vertices to make up your circles. I'll scale this down and into position, so somewhere around here, and RX90 to move it into position like this. Now it's absolutely fine to have it overlapping and inserted into our TV like this, but we have got a bit of a curve coming down here, which might be a good idea to try and rectify. So I'll select my TV into edit mode and have a quick think about how I can flatten this out so it stops curving in this direction so much. Well, this curve is affected by two aspects, this edge loop up here and this one here. Now we can't move this edge loop down very easily. I can go into edge mode and select from here to here and GG to edge slide and move that down. And that does help somewhat. It flattens it out a bit and starts curving from here. We can also, if I undo that, Control R and do a loop cut and bring it down this way. And that might be a bit more successful, keeping it flatter as we go down, and then it suddenly curves around here. If we want to maintain that curve coming around here, we can select this edge loop along here, and I'll go to front view for this, and GG to do that sort of double edge slide to curve things out slightly. So that's fairly successful. The other edge loop as I was talking about is this one here, and I can GG if I want to sharpen that up at all, and you can see how it's bringing that bottom area in here. I'll undo that and show you that again from the side here, and we've flattened it out in that way as well. That does of course flatten out all the way up our shape here. I actually slightly prefer that, so I think we'll leave it like that. I think we've possibly got a little bit too much space for our dials at the bottom, so I might just bring the base up a touch. So into wireframe, select all these and G then Z to move them up slightly to somewhere around here. Back out of wireframe, into object mode, and let's move the dial up G then Z. Just take a look around, make sure I haven't changed anything too drastically, and I think that's working well. So pause the video and catch up with me, adding your cylinder and making any modifications to the base section that you feel are necessary for your television. Okay, so lastly, what I want to do is with my cylinder here, it's got a very sharp edge, so I want to give that a bit more smoothness. First of all, I'll stick it out a little bit more from our television, so G then Y. Now it's a bit flatter. I can have it insert just a small amount about there. And let's add a subdivision surface modifier to our cylinder. So I'll press Ctrl 3 to do a subdivision surface modifier of 3 levels, but it looks a little bit strange. That's because if I go into edit mode, we have a very big n-gon, and the subdivision surface modifier much prefers quads, so 4-sided faces, rather than big n-gons like this. Hence we're getting all this sort of bumpiness. Now this is fairly straightforward to sort out. I can go into face mode, select this end face, and if I press I to inset and bring that in a bit, and left click, and go back into object mode, you can see it's sorted it out quite nicely at the front. I'll just isolate the shape for a moment with /, go back into edit mode and do the same for the back. So I to inset and bring that in, and you can see it's got a nice curve around here, but we haven't got all those strange bumps. Or certainly not so many. There's a little bit of wobbliness around here. The reason it's now keeping its structure more is because this face at the front and the faces around it are planar, so they're flat, as you can see around there. So it's using the quads from here for the curve, but this section it doesn't need to worry about so much. I could smooth this out even more by doing another inset here, and can you see how it's lost that slight wobble around here, and it slowly smooths out a bit better. I'll quickly show you what that looks like without that extra inset. If I go to object mode and shade smooth, you can see a little bit of bumpiness there. So back into edit mode and insert, and I'll go in a little bit further, back to object mode, and we've lost that wobble. Same around the back, into object mode, select that face, insert it, and again, much smoother now. So I'll go back into edit mode so you can see my cylinder, and I want you to pause the video here and catch up with me, adding a subdivision surface modifier to the sphere, and sorting out that wobbly anomaly by adding some insets for the faces. Now lastly, what I want you to do as your challenge is to sharpen up the curve going around here. So you'll have to think about how you edit the shape in order to do that. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you figured that out. We can add a loop cut along the side here by Control R, add a loop cut in, and suddenly it's a bit sharper, and I can bring this to the front if I like, if I want it to be a lot sharper, and maybe have one at the back as well to sharpen that up as well. And we can always GG to edge slide and move these about depending on how sharp or soft we want those edges. So back into object mode, back out of local view, and I think I'll press Shift D, X, and scale it down to create another dial next to this one. And we've got an interesting looking TV. So hopefully you're understanding the ideas behind subdivision surface modeling, and this will help you when it comes to building the body of our character in the next lecture. So as always, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time.